Obese Maid rejected for being too fat. Until the prince said, "She's perfect." The church bell tolls. A trembling maid stands in the great hall, her hands raw from labor, her head bowed in shame. The nobles sneer. The housekeeper points a cruel finger. Too fat, too clumsy, unfit to serve. She turns to flee, but then the room falls silent. A voice, steady and commanding, breaks through the jeers. "She's perfect." The prince's words shake the castle walls. But was it kindness or defiance? Whispers spread like wildfire. She is mocked by courtiers, dismissed by a furious king, cast back to her village in disgrace. Yet fate drags her back to the castle fires, where courage, sacrifice, and a dangerous secret will decide everything. When love dares to cross the line between crown and commoner, will her heart prove strong enough to change a kingdom? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The pale light of dawn crept over the thatched roofs of the village, painting the morning mist in shades of pearl and gold. In a small cottage at the edge of town, Margarethe stirred from her thin straw mattress, careful not to wake her mother, who slept fitfully in the bed they shared. The familiar ache in her chest tightened as she heard her mother's labored breathing. The illness that had taken hold these past months showed no signs of easing. Margarethe moved quietly through their humble home, her stockinged feet careful on the worn wooden floors. She retrieved her best dress from the peg by the door, a simple brown wool garment she had mended countless times, but kept neat and clean. The fabric was thin in places, but her careful stitching held it together with dignity. "Lord above," she whispered, fingers trembling as she fastened the brass buttons. "Grant me strength this day. Let me find work to care for Mother." She touched the small wooden cross that hung from a leather cord around her neck, her father's last gift before fever took him 3 winters past. Outside, the muddy road stretched toward the castle like a ribbon of brown silk in the growing light. Other young women were already making their way there, their shawls drawn tight against the morning chill. Some walked in pairs or small groups, their excited chatter carrying on the breeze. Margarethe walked alone, her worn boots squelching in the mud. The castle loomed ahead, its gray stone towers reaching toward the brightening sky. Margarethe's heart fluttered like a trapped bird as she joined the line of hopefuls in the great hall. The space smelled of beeswax and wood polish, so different from the homely scents of her mother's herb garden and cooking hearth. Frau Gertrude swept through the hall like a storm, clad in black silk, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she inspected each candidate. The housekeeper's lips seemed permanently pursed in disapproval, her gray hair pulled so tight beneath her cap that it made her eyes look stretched and cruel. "Stand straight," she barked at a trembling maid. "Show your hands, disgraceful next." Margarethe clasped her work-roughened hands together, willing them to stop shaking. When Frau Gertrude reached her, the housekeeper's nose wrinkled as though she'd smelled something unpleasant. "Well, well," Frau Gertrude announced, her voice carrying through the hushed hall. "What have we here?" She circled Margarethe slowly, like a hawk studying its prey. Too fat by half and no doubt clumsy as an ox. She prodded Margarethe's arm with her fan. "How do you expect to serve in a noble house looking like this?" Laughter rippled through the hall, cruel mocking sounds that cut deeper than winter wind. Some of the nobles who had gathered to observe the proceedings tittered behind their hands. Even fellow servants joined in, perhaps grateful not to be the target of Frau Gertrude's scorn. Margarethe's cheeks burned hot with shame. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she fought them back. She thought of her mother, alone in their cottage, counting on her to find work. But the laughter grew louder, and her courage crumbled like dry bread. She turned to flee, her vision blurring, when a voice cut through the mockery like sunlight through storm clouds. "She is perfect." The words rang clear and firm, silencing the laughter instantly. Exactly what this palace needs. Margarethe froze, hardly daring to breathe. Through her tears, she saw Prince Alaric standing in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. He wore riding clothes of fine blue wool, his boots still dusty from the morning's exercise. But it was his expression, kind yet authoritative, that held everyone transfixed. The prince's words hung in the suddenly silent hall, and Margarethe felt the weight of every eye upon her. But where moments before there had been cruel amusement, now there was only shocked silence. Frau Gertrude's face had gone pale, her fan clutched so tight her knuckles showed white. Margarethe stood trembling, caught between flight and hope, as Prince Alaric's unexpected declaration changed everything. In an instant, gasps echoed through the great hall as Prince Alaric strode forward, his polished boots clicking against the marble floor. The morning sunlight streaming through tall windows caught the gold buttons of his navy coat, but it was his commanding presence that drew every eye. The cruel laughter died instantly, replaced by a heavy silence. "My lord," Frau Gertrude stammered, her earlier sneer melting into a forced smile. "Surely you jest. This girl is hardly suitable for—" "I do not jest, Frau Gertrude." The prince's voice was quiet, but firm. "I have observed your selection process long enough. This young woman will join the castle staff today." Margarethe stood frozen, her cheeks still burning from the earlier mockery. She kept her eyes lowered, heart pounding so hard she feared others might hear it. Around her, the other applicants shifted and whispered, their earlier derision transformed to confusion and envy. "As is you wish, your highness." Frau Gertrude executed a stiff curtsy, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She gestured sharply to Margarethe, "Follow me, girl. And mind you don't break anything valuable." The housekeeper's brisk footsteps led them through grand corridors and down narrow stone stairs until they reached the warm, bustling kitchens. The scent of fresh bread and herbs filled the air, while copper pots gleamed in the firelight. Servants hurried about their tasks, casting curious glances at the newcomer. "This is the new kitchen maid," Frau Gertrude announced to the head cook, her tone making clear her disapproval. "Find her something simple she cannot ruin." With that, she swept away, leaving Margarethe standing uncertainly by the great hearth. Head cook, a stout woman named Martha, looked her over with more kindness than the housekeeper had shown. "Well then, let's start you with these turnips, shall we? Take that stool by the fire, and mind you peel them clean." Margarethe settled onto the wooden stool, grateful for any task that would let her prove her worth. As she worked, she caught fragments of whispered conversations around her. "Did you hear? The prince himself insisted she be hired. Poor thing. You know how these things go. Some lord takes a fancy to a pretty face. Pretty? Have you eyes in your head? More likely. He planned some sport. Hush now, that's unkind. The prince isn't like that. The pile of turnips slowly diminished as Margarethe worked steadily, trying to ignore the whispers. Her hands were sure and careful with the knife, though her heart felt as raw as the vegetables she peeled. The day passed in a blur of tasks: washing pots, chopping vegetables, feeding the kitchen fires. When evening finally came, an older maid showed her to the servants' quarters. The small chamber she would share with two other maids held narrow beds with clean but worn blankets. A single window looked out over the castle's kitchen gardens, now silvered by moonlight. Her roommates had not yet returned from their duties, leaving Margarethe blessedly alone. She changed into her nightdress, her muscles aching from the day's work. The stone floor was cold under her knees as she knelt beside her bed, clasping her father's cross. "Thank you, Lord, for answering my prayers for work," she whispered. "But why did the prince speak for me? I am nothing special, everyone can see that." A tear slid down her cheek as she remembered the cruel laughter, followed by the prince's unexpected intervention. "Please help me prove worthy of this chance." High above in his private chambers, Prince Alaric stood at his window, lost in thought. His gaze drifted to the distant wing where the servants slept, its windows glowing with candlelight. He had noticed something in the young woman's face that morning, not just shame at the mockery, but a quiet dignity and kindness in how she had helped another applicant who had dropped her shawl, even in the midst of her own humiliation. Prince turned from the window, troubled by the casual cruelty he had witnessed in his father's court. In the new kitchen maid's gentle manner, he had seen something rare and precious, a genuine heart in a world too often ruled by appearances. And artifice. The next morning brought a chill that crept through the castle's stone walls. Margarethe woke in darkness, her thin blanket offering little warmth in the servants' quarters. She dressed quickly, smoothing her worn gray dress with careful hands before making her way to the kitchen. The great hearths stood cold and black. Margarethe set to work, her movements precise despite her size. She arranged kindling and struck flint until flames caught, then added larger logs one by one. Soon, welcome heat filled the space as fires roared in all three hearths. As she kneaded bread dough with practiced hands, the kitchen slowly came alive around her. Two scullery maids, Anne and Beth, entered carrying water buckets, their whispered conversation growing clearer as they drew near. "Did you hear?" Anne's excited voice carried across the kitchen. "The Princess of Saxony arrives next month. They say she's as beautiful as a spring morning." Beth nodded eagerly. "Father says it's all arranged. Prince Alaric is to marry her before winter comes. The alliance will bring trade routes and soldiers if needed." Margarethe's hands stilled in the dough for just a moment before she forced them to continue their work. Of course the prince would marry a princess. What else had she expected? The morning passed in a blur of tasks: hauling water, stoking fires, preparing vegetables for the day's meals. Shortly before noon, her arms full of fresh linens, Margarethe crossed the courtyard on an errand to the upper chambers. The clatter of hooves on cobblestones made her pause. Prince Alaric rode through the gates, his dark cloak billowing behind him. He dismounted with easy grace, handing the reins to a waiting stable boy. When his eyes met hers across the yard, he offered a gentle nod of acknowledgement. Heat rushed to Margarethe's cheeks as she curtsied deeply. Behind her, she heard the rustle of silk and quiet laughter. A group of courtiers watched from the covered walkway, their painted fans hiding smirking mouths. One lady whispered something that made the others titter behind their lace. "Poor dear." A silken voice carried just far enough for Margarethe to hear. "She actually thinks his kindness means something." Margarethe hurried inside, clutching the linens closer. The rest of her day passed in careful focus on her duties, trying to make herself as invisible as possible, while completing her tasks that evening brought the grand dinner with foreign envoys. Margarethe joined the line of servants carrying dishes. Into the great hall, crystal goblets sparkled in candlelight, and the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine filled the air. At the head table, Prince Alaric sat beside his father, the king. His fine blue coat suited him well, but tension showed in the set of his shoulders. As Margarethe placed a platter of glazed peacock on the table, she caught a glimpse of his face. Though he smiled and nodded at the proper moments, weariness lurked in his eyes. The king rose, lifting his golden goblet. "To our honored guests from Saxony, may this alliance bring prosperity to both our lands." His voice boomed across the hall. "And to my son's upcoming betrothal to the lovely Princess Elise." The hall erupted in cheers. Nobles raised their glasses, wine sloshing as they toasted enthusiastically. Margarethe watched as Prince Alaric lifted his own cup, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Standing against the wall with other servants, Margarethe felt cold dread settle in her stomach. The prince's kindness yesterday had drawn attention that could only bring danger. Already, courtiers whispered and sneered. How long before their amusement turned to suspicion or spite? The betrothal announcement seemed to make her position even more precarious. A common servant who had caught the prince's notice, however briefly, could easily become a target for court gossip or worse. The weight of her situation pressed down on her as she watched the revelry continue. Feeling more out of place than ever in the glittering hall, a week passed like water flowing in the castle's stone channels. Each dawn found Margarethe at her tasks, her capable hands moving from one duty to the next. The heavy wooden buckets no longer made her arms tremble as she drew water from the well. Her fingers knew the perfect moment when bread dough had been kneaded just enough, neither too sticky nor too dry. On this particular morning, young Clara, a kitchen maid of barely 14 summers, hurried through the servants' corridor with a laden breakfast tray. Her foot caught on an uneven flagstone, sending silver dishes clattering across the floor. The girl's face went white as chalk. "Useless child." Frau Gertrude's sharp voice cut through the air from the far end of the hall. Her footsteps clicked closer, fast and threatening. Without hesitation, Margarethe swept forward. "Peace, child," she whispered to Clara, gathering the scattered dishes with swift hands. "Stand aside." In moments, she had restored the tray, straightened the linens, and positioned herself before the trembling girl. Frau Gertrude rounded the corner, her face dark with promised punishment. But Margarethe stood calm, the tray perfectly arranged in her steady grip. "Forgive the noise, Frau. I stumbled but caught myself in time. Nothing is damaged." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed, darting between Margarethe and Clara, but with no evidence of disaster. She could only press her lips together and wave them on. Clara's grateful look warmed Margarethe's heart more than any praise could have done. That evening, as Margarethe stirred a pot of hearty stew, a figure in a plain brown cloak slipped through the kitchen's back door. Her heart jumped when he lowered his hood. Prince Alaric himself stood before her, though dressed as simply as any merchant. "Your Highness," she breathed, dropping into a curtsy. "Please," he said softly, "no formality here." His eyes took in the bubbling pots, the fresh-baked loaves cooling on wooden racks. "I often wonder what the castle's simpler fare tastes like. Might I?" He gestured to the stew pot. Margarethe's hands trembled slightly as she ladled stew into a wooden bowl. Other servants moved quietly about their tasks, stealing glances but maintaining a respectful distance. "This is what sustains the castle's heart," Alaric said, settling onto a rough wooden bench. "While we dine above on elaborate dishes, this is what gives strength to those who truly keep these walls standing." "You are kind to say so, Mill, sir." Margarethe stood nearby, uncertain whether to stay or go. "Please sit," he said. "Tell me about this stew." She settled carefully on the bench's far end, explaining how she'd learned to make the most of simple ingredients from her mother. As they talked, his shoulders seemed to relax, as if setting down a heavy burden. "Sometimes I wish ... he began, then shook his head. "Freedom comes in unexpected forms, doesn't it? Even in choosing what fills one's bowl." "There is freedom in small things," Margarethe agreed softly. "In tending a fire just so, or adding an extra pinch of herbs to bring comfort to someone's meal." The kitchen's warm air grew thick with unspoken words. Candles burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Neither seemed to notice the time passing until a sharp intake of breath broke the spell. Frau Gertrude stood in the doorway, her face a mask of shocked disapproval. "Your Highness," she said with exaggerated concern, "surely you are needed above stairs? The evening grows late." Alaric stood quickly, pulling up his hood. "Indeed, I thank you for the meal and ... conversation." His eyes met Margarethe's for a brief moment before he strode away. Margarethe's heart hammered in her chest as Frau Gertrude's calculating gaze fell upon her. The housekeeper's thin smile promised future retribution, but Margarethe could think only of the way Alaric's voice had softened when speaking of freedom, and how his eyes had held not mockery but understanding. the candles guttered in their holders, and the kitchen grew still. Yet something had changed in that quiet hour, something that filled Margarethe with equal measures of joy and fear. Autumn painted the castle grounds in rich golds and crimsons as the harvest festival filled the courtyard with warmth and light. Paper lanterns swayed on strings between the stone walls, casting dancing shadows across faces both common and noble. The scent of roasted apples and spiced cider drifted through the evening air while fiddles and drums called people to dance. Margarethe moved through the crowd with a heavy pitcher of cider, filling wooden cups for thirsty revelers. Her own cup remained untouched at her station, though she desperately wished to taste the sweet autumn drink. Above, nobles watched from their balconies, their fine silks and jewels catching the lantern light as they observed the festivities with distant amusement. "Another cup, if you please," came a familiar voice that made her heart skip. Prince Alaric stood before her, but not in his usual finery. He wore simpler garments, though still far finer than any commoner's festival clothes. His eyes held that same warmth she'd come to know during his visits to the kitchen. "Your Highness," she curtsied, careful not to spill the pitcher as she poured. "Should you not be above with the other nobles?" "I find the view much better from here," he said softly. Then, to her astonishment, he set down his cup and extended his hand. "Would you honor me with a dance?" Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Margarethe's hand trembled as she set down the pitcher. "Your Highness, I couldn't possibly." "You can," he said firmly, yet gentle, "and you will." When she placed her work-roughened hand in his, the whispers grew to a storm. Noble ladies on the balconies pressed together, scandalized, while their menfolk scowled. But Alaric led her to where couples whirled in circles, and suddenly none of that seemed to matter. He placed one hand properly at her waist, the other holding hers aloft, and guided her into the steps of a country dance. Margarethe's cheeks burned, certain she would stumble, but his steady presence kept her feet moving true. The fiddles sang louder, and the villagers began to clap in rhythm. "Everyone is staring," she whispered, trying not to look at the shocked faces around them. "Let them," he replied, spinning her beneath his arm. "You dance as gracefully as any lady at court." The simple praise brought tears to her eyes, but she blinked them away. This was no time for weeping, not when joy filled her heart near to bursting. They turned and stepped, her skirts swishing against his legs. The common folk had begun to cheer, their approval drowning out the disapproving murmurs from above. Some even shouted encouragement, making Margarethe laugh despite herself. The sound seemed to please Alaric, whose smile grew broader. He leaned close as they moved through the figures of the dance. "You are braver than them all," he whispered near her ear. "Every day you face their scorn with dignity. Every day you show more nobility than those born to titles." Before she could respond, the sky erupted in color and sound. The festivals. Fireworks painted the night in brilliant bursts of gold and red, drawing gasps of wonder from the crowd. Alaric's hand tightened briefly on hers as they paused to watch, and Margarethe allowed herself to savor this moment that felt more like a dream than reality. All too soon, the last spark faded from the sky, and the spell was broken. Alaric bowed over her hand with perfect courtesy, then melted into the crowd before anyone could intercept him. Margarethe made her way back to the servants' wing, her cheeks still flushed from dancing. With each step, she could feel the memory of his hand in hers, the warmth of his grip, the strength in his fingers. Her heart felt as though it might float right out of her chest. The other servants she passed gave her curious looks, some friendly, others less so, but she hardly noticed them. In the quiet of the servants' corridor, Margarethe finally allowed herself to touch her waist where his hand had rested, remembering the gentle pressure of his touch. She knew she should not dwell on such things, that nothing could ever come of it, but for just this one night, she would permit herself to dream. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace corridors, but darkness already crept into Margarethy's heart. Word of her dance with Prince Alaric spread through the castle like wildfire, carried on whispers and sideways glances. Ladies-in-waiting clutched their fans, heads bent close as they passed her in the halls. "Did you see how she threw herself at him?" One courtier's voice drifted clearly through an archway. "A common kitchen maid, presuming to dance with our prince. She must have bewitched him somehow," another added with a sniff. "These peasant girls are crafty when they want to rise above their station." Margarethy kept her head down as she carried linens past them, her cheeks burning. The joy of last night's dance turned to ashes in her memory. Where there had been music and magic, now there was only shame and suspicion. In the royal wing, King Frederick's voice boomed through heavy oak doors. "This ends now, Alaric. Your behavior makes a mockery of our lineage and endangers the alliance with Saxony." "Father, please." Alaric's protest was cut short. "Enough. The announcement of your betrothal to Princess Elise will be made today. I will hear no more about this this servant girl." Margarethy hurried past, her heart breaking, but she could not escape the echoes of their argument. Within hours, royal guards appeared in the kitchen where she worked. Their presence silenced the usual clatter of pots and cheerful chatter. Frau Gertrude swept in behind them, her face twisted with cruel satisfaction. "Margarethy," she barked, "you are dismissed from service immediately. How dare you attempt to seduce His Highness and bring scandal to this noble house?" The other servants shrank back, leaving Margarethy alone in the center of the kitchen. "I never," she began, but Frau Gertrude raised her voice to drown out any defense. "Pack your things and leave at once. Let this be a lesson to all who forget their proper place." From the doorway, several noble ladies watched with obvious pleasure. "Such shameless behavior," one commented loudly. "Trying to trap a prince with her common wiles." "These lower classes are all the same," another agreed. "Greedy and manipulative. They must be taught respect." Margarethy's hands trembled as she gathered her few belongings from the servants' quarters. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall where others could see. Through a window, she glimpsed Prince Alaric in the courtyard below, his fists clenched at his sides as he spoke with royal advisors. Though he looked toward the servants' wing, he made no move to intervene. She understood. He was a prince, bound by duty and his father's will. What could he do against the combined weight of tradition, politics, and social order? Still, the memory of his whispered words at the festival, "You are braver than them all," now felt like a cruel jest. With her bundle clutched to her chest, Margarethy walked through the castle gates one last time. The same road she had traveled with such hope now stretched before her like a path of thorns. Mud clung to her shoes, as if the very earth conspired to make her journey more difficult. Each step away from the castle drove home the bitter truth. She had dared to dream too high, to imagine that kindness and character might matter more than birth and station. Now she would return to her village in disgrace, marked by scandal, her chance at a respectable position forever ruined. The cottage where her mother waited seemed smaller and shabbier than before. Margarethy's shoulders shook with silent sobs as she trudged the final steps. All her hopes of supporting her family, of earning dignity through honest work, lay shattered behind her. What would become of them now? Who would hire a maid dismissed from the castle in scandal? The weight of these questions pressed down on her like stones as she reached for the cottage door, her tears finally falling freely in the privacy of her shame. Note: this completes the outlined events while maintaining the emotional depth and historical context requested. Reaching approximately 920 words, the autumn wind whistled through the thatched roof of Margarethy's cottage as she stirred the morning porridge. 3 days had passed since her dismissal from the castle, each hour marked by her mother's worried glances and neighbors' whispered conversations. She focused on the simple tasks that had filled her life before, spinning rough wool into yarn, feeding their small flock of chickens, and tending to her mother's worsening cough. "Did you hear?" Old Martha from next door called over the fence that morning. "They say the prince danced with her at the harvest festival. Can you imagine such boldness?" Some villagers crossed the street to avoid her, as if disgrace might be catching. Others, like kind-hearted widow Bergen, pressed small gifts of vegetables into her hands with understanding smiles. "Pay them no mind, dear," the widow had whispered. "Many a noble has led a servant girl astray with false hopes." But Margarethe knew Alaric's attention had not been false. The memory of his gentle eyes and strong hands during their dance sustained her through long nights of uncertainty. At the castle, life continued its grand procession without her. Through gossip carried by the market traders, she learned of elaborate dinners where Prince Alaric sat beside Princess Elise, their impending engagement, the talk of every noble household. The princess, they said, was everything a future bride should be: graceful, accomplished, and of proper breeding. When not required at formal functions, Alaric took to his horse, racing across the countryside as if pursued by demons. Servants reported seeing him return at dusk, his mount lathered with sweat, his face dark with brooding. He spoke little at meals and danced with no one, though the court held regular entertainments to honor his betrothal. On the fourth morning, as Margarethe collected eggs from the henhouse, the clip-clop of hooves drew her attention. A castle messenger in livery reined his horse before her gate, holding out a sealed note. "From the kitchen staff, miss," he said kindly, touching his cap. "They ask for your help." With trembling fingers, Margarethe broke the seal. Inside, Cook's familiar scrawl explained that a grand banquet was planned for foreign dignitaries. Would she please supply her special honey bread and sharp mountain cheese? The castle kitchens had not been the same without her touch. Margarethe pressed the note to her chest, touched by this olive branch from her former friends below stairs. Yet fear fluttered in her stomach like trapped birds. To return to the castle, even briefly, risked fresh humiliation or worse. Another glimpse of Alaric that would only deepen her pain. "What is it, child?" her mother called from her chair. "By the fire." "The castle kitchens need bread and cheese for a banquet," Margarethe replied softly. They asked me to bring it myself." Her mother's face creased with concern. Perhaps it would be wiser to send it with young Thomas from the mill? But Margarethe straightened her shoulders, remembering Alaric's words at the festival. "You are braver than them all." "No, mother, I will go myself. They were kind to me once. I won't hide as if I've done wrong." She spent the day preparing, kneading the honey bread her fellow servants had so loved, checking the aging cheese in the cool cellar, gathering fresh herbs to tuck between the loaves. As she worked, she prayed for courage to face whatever awaited her at the castle. That night, she barely slept, watching the stars wheel past her small window. When the first pale light touched the eastern sky, she rose quietly, dressed in her cleanest dress, and wrapped her goods in clean linen. The bread was still slightly warm, filling her baskets with its sweet scent. "God keep you safe," her mother whispered, making the sign of the cross as Margarethe adjusted her shawl. She stepped out into the pearly dawn, dew soaking her worn shoes as she started down the familiar road to the castle. Birds called from the hedgerows, and a cool mist clung to the hollows. Margarethe squared her shoulders and walked steadily forward, unaware that this simple delivery would test her courage. More than she could imagine, the grand banquet hall glowed with hundreds of beeswax candles, their light dancing off golden plates and crystal goblets. While nobles feasted above, Margarethe slipped quietly through the servants' entrance into the bustling kitchen, her arms laden with fresh provisions. The familiar warmth and savory aromas brought an ache to her heart. This place had briefly felt like home. "Bless me, if it isn't our Margarethe," old cook Thomas whispered, taking her baskets. "The kitchen hasn't been the same without you, lass." She managed a small smile, keeping her eyes down as she helped unpack the fresh bread and cheese. Through the kitchen archway, she could glimpse the nobles dining in splendor. Prince Alaric seated beside Princess Elise, both of them picture perfect in their finery. The sight made her hands tremble slightly as she arranged wheels of cheese on wooden platters. "Mind that lamp, boy," Cook Thomas suddenly bellowed at a young scullery lad who'd bumped against a table. But the warning came too late. The oil lamp toppled, shattering against the flagstones. Flames leapt up the nearby wall hangings with frightening speed. "Fire!" The cry went up as panic erupted. Thick smoke began filling the kitchen as the fire raced along the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Servants scattered in terror, dropping platters and bowls with a crash. "Stay calm," Margaret's voice cut through the chaos. Years of managing her mother's cottage in crisis had taught her clear-headedness. "Form a line to the well. Pass buckets. Thomas, lead the younger ones out the back door." To her surprise, the panicked servants responded to her authority. They fell into line, passing water buckets while others helped the elderly cook guide kitchen boys toward safety. But the flames were spreading too quickly, feeding on spilled oil and dry wood. Through the thickening smoke, Margarethe heard a cry from the back stairwell, the one noble sometimes used to steal treats from the kitchen. Her heart stopped as she spotted Princess Elise through the haze, coughing and disoriented, her silk skirts trailing dangerously near the flames. Without hesitation, Margarethe plunged through the smoke toward her. The heat seared her lungs and made her eyes water, but she pressed on. "Your Highness!" "This way," the princess swayed, overcome by smoke. Margarethe reached her just as she started to collapse. Though the princess was slender, her elaborate court dress made her awkward to move. Margarethe wrapped her arms around Elise's waist and half carried, half dragged her toward the kitchen door. "Almost there," she gasped encouragingly, though her own vision was starting to blur. The princess's head lolled against her shoulder as they stumbled through the smoky darkness. Margarethe's lungs felt like they were on fire, but she refused to let go. With one final surge of strength, she hauled them both through the door into the blessed cool night air. Alarmed nobles and servants crowded the courtyard, watching as flames lit up the kitchen windows. The princess began coughing violently as fresh air hit her lungs. Guards rushed forward to support her, while Margarethe sank to her knees in exhaustion. Her plain dress was streaked with soot, her face and hands blackened. "She saved the princess," she heard someone whisper. "The kitchen maid they dismissed. Through smoke-stung eyes, she saw nobles and villagers alike staring at her with newfound respect. Even Frau Gertrude looked shocked. Princess Elise was being tended by her ladies, but her gaze kept returning to Margarethe with an expression of wonder. Margarethe hardly noticed it all. The world was starting to spin as smoke and exhaustion took their toll. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was Prince Alaric pushing through the crowd toward her, his face a mask of concern. She slumped to the ground outside the kitchen door, the cobblestones cool against her cheek, as darkness claimed her. Dawn's pale light filtered through the great hall's towering windows, casting long shadows across the gathered crowd. Word of the previous night's fire and Margarethe's heroic actions had spread like wildfire through both castle and village. Now hundreds packed the hall, from richly dressed nobles to humble peasants, all awaiting King Frederick's judgment. Margarethe stood before the throne, her plain dress still bearing traces of smoke, her hands clasped tightly to still their trembling. The king sat stern-faced upon his carved wooden throne, his crown gleaming in the morning light as he listened to the heated whispers of his advisers. "Your Majesty," a silk-clad courtier stepped forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "We must not forget that this servant girl has already caused considerable disruption to the planned alliance with Saxony. Her previous impropriety with the prince." "Impropriety?" A clear voice rang out across the hall. Prince Alaric strode forward, his boots echoing on the stone floor. His blue eyes blazed with determination as he faced his father. "I will speak. Now of true propriety, father. Of courage, of sacrifice, of the qualities that should matter more than birth or station." A hushed silence fell over the hall. Even the birds outside seemed to still their morning songs. "I will not wed for politics," Alaric declared, his voice carrying to every corner. "I will not bind myself to a loveless marriage when my heart has already chosen." He moved to stand beside Margarethe, who gazed up at him with wondering eyes. This woman, whom some would dismiss as merely a servant, showed more nobility last night than I have seen in a lifetime of royal courts. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margarethe felt her cheeks flush as Alaric continued, recounting her actions during the fire. While others fled, she led servants to safety. When told Princess Elise was trapped, she rushed back into the flames without hesitation. She risked her life not for glory or gain, but because she values all lives equally. From the crowd, villagers began to call out in support. "God bless Margarethe. She saved my cousin in the kitchen. She has always helped others." The king's expression remained unchanged, but his fingers drummed thoughtfully on his throne's armrest. "And what of our alliance with Saxony? Would you throw away years of diplomatic work for love?" A rustle of silk announced Princess Elise's approach. She stepped forward, still bearing traces of smoke on her elegant gown. "Your Majesty," she said, dropping into a graceful curtsy, "if I may speak?" At the king's nod, she continued, "Last night I learned that true nobility dwells not in titles, but in actions. This woman saved my life without thought for herself. I would rather see Prince Alaric wed to one of such proven character than bind him to a marriage of mere convenience." The hall grew so quiet that the crackle of the hearth fire seemed loud. King Frederick's stern facade cracked slightly as he looked from his son to Margarethe, then to the grateful princess. "The people seem to have made their judgment," he said at last, his voice softer than before. "Perhaps it is time for kings to listen." He straightened in his throne. Margarethe stepped forward. She approached on trembling legs, dropping into a deep curtsy. "You have shown exceptional courage and character," the king pronounced. "If my son has chosen you, and if Princess Elise herself supports this choice—" He paused, meeting the hopeful eyes of his son. "Then I shall not stand in the way of true love and proven worth." The hall erupted in cheers. Villagers embraced each other, their jubilant cries drowning out the disapproving mutters of certain nobles. "Margarethe! Margarethe!" They chanted, their voices rising to the rafters. Through tears of joy, Margarethe saw Alaric beaming at her, his face alight with love and triumph. Princess Elise offered her a warm smile, while even some of the nobles began to bow their heads in reluctant acceptance. The king raised his hand for silence. Though his expression remained dignified, there was a new warmth in his eyes as he gazed upon the couple before him. The people's chants faded to an expectant hush, their joy still palpable in the morning air, as they witnessed love's victory over tradition. The morning sun blessed the castle chapel with golden light as wedding bells rang out across the land. 3 weeks had passed since the banns were first read in church, announcing the unprecedented union between Prince Alaric and Margarethe. Each Sunday, the priest's proclamation had drawn larger crowds, until today, when the chapel overflowed with witnesses to this extraordinary love story. Margarethe stood before the chapel's great wooden doors, her heart fluttering beneath her simple white gown. Though the royal seamstresses had offered elaborate silks and laces, she had chosen unadorned cotton, its clean lines and modest cut reflecting her true nature. Her mother, dressed in her finest borrowed shawl, squeezed her hand with tears of pride. Inside, hundreds of candles cast their warm glow upon the gathered congregation, a remarkable mix of society rarely seen in one place. Nobles in their finest satin sat beside villagers in freshly pressed woolens, while castle servants filled The back rows, all united in witnessing this triumph of love over tradition. As the chapel doors opened, Margarethe caught her first glimpse of Alaric waiting at the altar. He stood tall and proud in his formal attire, his eyes finding hers with such devotion that her steps grew steady with certainty. The assembled crowd turned to watch her passage, and for once, their stares held no judgment, only wonder and joy. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed chapel. "We are gathered here to join these two souls, chosen by God's grace to show us that true nobility lies in the heart." Throughout the ceremony, whispers of approval rippled through the congregation. Even those nobles who had once scorned Margarethe found themselves moved by the obvious love between bride and groom. When Alaric spoke his vows, his voice rang with certainty that echoed off the ancient stones. Margarethe's response, though softer, carried no less conviction. As the priest pronounced them married, the chapel erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations. Bells pealed out once more, their joyous sound calling the entire kingdom to celebration. The festivities spilled into the courtyard, where tables groaned under the weight of fresh bread, roasted meats, and sweet pastries, a feast for all, regardless of rank. Musicians struck up lively tunes, their melodies weaving through the happy chaos of dancing and laughter. "God bless our new princes," called out the village baker, raising his mug, who rose not by beauty's charm or fortune's favor, but by courage and love. The crowd responded, having heard the tale of her bravery during the fire countless times. Margarethe moved through the celebration, accepting congratulations from every quarter. She stopped to embrace her fellow kitchen servants, who had become like family during her time below stairs. She curtsied to Princess Elise, who had become an unexpected ally and friend. Even Frau Gertrude, the stern housekeeper, offered a reluctant bow of respect. As evening drew its purple cloak across the sky, the celebrating continued below, but Alaric drew his bride away to a quiet balcony overlooking the village. Candles twinkled in windows across the valley, mirroring the stars beginning to appear above. The music from the courtyard floated up softly, creating a gentle backdrop to this private moment. Taking her hand in his, Alaric turned to face Margarethe. His eyes shone with emotion as he gazed at his bride, now his princess, yet still the same compassionate soul who had first caught his attention in the servants' hall. "It was never your form, my love," he whispered, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm, "but your soul. You were always perfect." Margarethe's heart swelled with joy as she stood beside her prince, their fingers entwined, watching the celebration of their love continue to unfold in the courtyard below. The simple maid and her noble prince had proven that true love knows no boundaries, and that perfect hearts find each other despite all odds. Thank you for watching. Stories like this remind us who we are. If something touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story that just might stay with you.